Welcome to True Crime Threads, where we dive into the darkest stories. Today, a family's desperate choices lead to devastating consequences. Rebecca and Mark had always dreamed of a better life for their children, but it seemed more distant with each passing day. They lived in a small suburban home, tucked away on a quiet street, but behind the neat facade, their lives were far from perfect. The stress of rising bills and medical expenses weighed heavily on them. Rebecca worked long hours at the local grocery store, stocking shelves and ringing up customers, but her paycheck barely covered the basics. Mark, a skilled mechanic, had hoped that his trade would provide for his family, but his business had slowed, and he struggled to find enough work to keep things afloat. The couple often found themselves sitting at the kitchen table late into the night, staring at bills they couldn't pay and wondering how they would make it through the next month. Their two children, Emma and Ethan, didn't fully understand the weight of their parents' worries. Emma, a curious 8-year-old, spent her days drawing pictures of a world far brighter than the one she lived in, while Ethan, only 5, was too young to grasp the struggles around him. But the burden of their future loomed large over Rebecca and Mark. Every decision they made, from how much food to buy to whether they could afford the next doctor's visit, seemed to carry the weight of their children's future. They wanted to provide a life full of opportunities, one where their children wouldn't have to worry about money, where they could go to college, travel, and follow their dreams without the constraints that had trapped them. Despite their best efforts, the future they hoped for was slipping through their fingers. Rebecca had tried to apply for a second job, but her schedule already left her exhausted, and the thought of adding more hours seemed impossible. Mark had taken on side jobs, fixing cars for neighbors and friends, but it was never enough to make a dent in the mounting debt. They had maxed out credit cards just to keep up with essentials, and the weight of their growing financial strain was suffocating. It wasn't just the bills they feared, it was the potential consequences of not being able to provide for their children. Mark, once optimistic about finding success through his mechanics, now saw his hope of a better future slipping away, and Rebecca felt a growing panic that they would fail their kids. One evening, after a particularly hard day, Mark came home later than usual, his face etched with frustration. He sat down at the table, looking at Rebecca with a troubled expression. As they discussed the growing pressure they both felt, the tension between them thickened. Neither of them knew what the next step should be, but they both agreed that something had to change. The dream of a better life for their children felt like it was slipping further away, and one evening, while Mark was working late at a nearby garage, he overheard a conversation that would alter the course of his life. A man, rough around the edges and with a demeanor that screamed danger, had pulled into the shop to get some work done on his car. Mark, being the mechanic, was assigned the task. The man was evasive when asked about the nature of the repairs, speaking in short, cryptic answers. But as the conversation progressed, Mark realized the man wasn't just any ordinary customer. The man's offer seemed to come out of nowhere. He casually mentioned that they could use someone with Mark's skills, someone who could fix cars quickly and quietly. In exchange for Mark's services, he promised a substantial sum of money, more than enough to cover the bills and debts that had been slowly drowning them. The pay was enough to make Mark pause, but it was the promise of financial freedom that made the decision more appealing. Mark's mind raced as the weight of their situation came crashing down on him. This was the answer he had been looking for, but he knew it came at a cost. He was no fool. The criminal world wasn't clean, and it wasn't forgiving. Still, the temptation to secure a future for his children was overwhelming. When he returned home that evening, Rebecca could sense something was off. He was quieter than usual, his mind clearly preoccupied with the offer he had received. After a long silence, Mark revealed the details of the conversation. Rebecca's initial reaction was disbelief. She knew that getting involved with criminals could lead to dangerous outcomes. But as Mark laid out the figures, showing her how much money they could make in just a few months, her resolve began to waver. The thought of finally being free from the constant stress, of giving Emma and Ethan a life they deserved, clouded her judgment. Mark assured her that it would only be temporary. Just a few jobs, he promised, and then they would be able to leave everything behind: the debts, the stress, the fear of their children growing up with nothing. Rebecca was hesitant, but the idea of a better life for their children seemed so close. They had nothing left to lose, and the risk felt like a necessary evil. After hours of back and forth, Rebecca reluctantly agreed. It wasn't the choice she wanted to make, but it was the choice she felt forced to make for the sake of their family. That night, as they lay in bed, the weight of their decision hung heavy in the air. Mark knew that once they crossed this line, there would be no going back. But in the quiet of the night, with his wife by his side and their children peacefully asleep, he convinced himself that they were doing the right thing. They were doing it for their children's future. The days that followed marked the beginning of a downward spiral for Mark and Rebecca. At first, the work was simple, just fixing cars that had been stolen and stripped for parts. Mark could do it with his eyes closed, and the pay was immediate and generous. He was still able to manage his regular work, and they began to pay down some of their debt. Rebecca, though uneasy about the illegal nature of Mark's new job, tried to focus on the benefits. She convinced herself that it was temporary, that they would eventually escape the clutches of crime once they had enough money to start fresh. But soon the jobs became more complicated. Mark was asked to fix high-end vehicles that were in far worse condition than he had anticipated. The work was no longer simple repairs, it was a constant race against time to make stolen cars look pristine enough to be resold without attracting attention. As the stakes grew, so did the risks. Mark found himself working in dark, hidden locations, always with the threat of being caught hanging over him. The men he was working for weren't just criminals, they were dangerous, unpredictable, and ruthless. Mark was beginning to realize that the small favor he had initially agreed to was slowly pulling him deeper into a world he couldn't easily escape. Rebecca started noticing the changes in Mark. He wasn't the same man who had come home with excitement about the extra money. He was distant, tired, and irritable. He stopped talking about the future, the dreams they had once shared of a better life. Instead, he spent his days lost in his thoughts, weighed down by guilt, and his nights working in secrecy. Rebecca tried to ask him about it, but he was quick to reassure her that everything was fine, that he was just stressed, but it was clear that the job was taking a toll on him. She could see it in his eyes, the constant worry, the fear that everything was spiraling out of control. One night, when Mark came home late after another job, he was visibly shaken. He had barely spoken a word all evening, his eyes hollow. Rebecca sat him down, pressing him for answers. He reluctantly told her that things had escalated. The criminal syndicate had begun to rely on him more and more, pushing him to take on riskier jobs. Mark knew that if he refused, they wouldn't hesitate to hurt him or worse, his family. The idea of jeopardizing their children's safety pushed him to keep going, even though his conscience screamed for him to stop. The weight of it all was breaking him, but Mark kept telling himself that it would all be worth it in the end. They were doing this for their children's future, he repeated to himself. But as the days wore on, he began to realize how deeply he had already been pulled into the criminal web, and that there was no easy way out. The decisions he had made in the name of love and protection were leading him down a path he could no longer control. One night, everything that Mark had feared finally came to pass. He had been tasked with overseeing the transportation of several stolen luxury vehicles to a new location, a job that was far riskier than any he had done before. Mark had hoped that this would be the last one, that they would finally have enough money to leave the dangerous world he had been pulled into. But things went horribly wrong. During the transfer, one of the vehicles broke down, and the situation quickly escalated into chaos. The police were called after a neighbor saw the commotion, and Mark, along with the other men involved, found themselves trapped in a risky standoff. Mark barely managed to escape the scene, but the cost was steep. Not only had he narrowly avoided capture, but the syndicate had suffered a major blow. The stolen cars had been confiscated, and the criminals were furious. The fallout from the failed job was swift. Mark knew that his involvement had sealed his fate. The criminals would not let this go unpunished. He had betrayed their trust, and they were now making it clear that there would be severe consequences if he didn't make things right. When Mark returned home that night, Rebecca could immediately tell something was wrong. His face was pale, his hands shaking. He didn't speak at first, but as she pressed him, he finally confessed the full extent of the disaster. The criminals had made it clear that if he didn't follow through on their demands, they would come after his family. The weight of his decision to protect them had never felt heavier. Mark knew that the men he had become entangled with were not the kind to be reasoned with. They wouldn't hesitate to hurt anyone to make their point. Rebecca was horrified. She had known that things had been spiraling, but she had never imagined that it would come to this. Mark's words were a terrifying reminder of just how deep they were in. The life they had worked so hard to build was now in the hands of criminals who cared nothing for their family or their well-being. The future they had dreamt of for Emma and Ethan now seemed impossible. Rebecca was filled with a surge of panic as she realized that they were no longer in control of their lives. Mark had crossed a line, and now there was no turning back. In the days that followed, Mark tried to come up with a plan to fix things, but the criminals were always one step ahead. The pressure mounted with every passing hour, and Mark was left with a choice that seemed more impossible by the day: do whatever it took to meet the syndicate's demands, or risk losing everything. Rebecca, equally terrified, tried to support him, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the life they had known was slipping away, piece by piece. The danger they had once thought they could manage had become a terrifying reality, and they were now trapped in a nightmare of their own making. The consequences of Mark and Rebecca's decisions came quickly and with devastating force. As the criminals tightened their grip, Mark found himself with no clear way out. The syndicate's demands grew more dangerous, and every move he made seemed to push him further into a corner. When he finally made an attempt to distance himself, hoping that he could salvage what was left of his integrity and protect his family, it was already too late. The syndicate retaliated, and Mark's arrest came as a shock, not only to him but to Rebecca as well. Mark's capture was swift and brutal. The police had been closing in on the syndicate for weeks, and Mark's involvement had been discovered through a tip from someone within the organization. The authorities had no sympathy for him. They saw him as another criminal, tangled in a web of illegal activity. Rebecca was left to face the reality of her worst fears. Mark was gone, arrested, and now facing serious charges. The life they had tried so hard to build was crumbling before her eyes. She was left with the daunting task of trying to keep the family together while Mark sat behind bars, his future uncertain. But Rebecca's troubles didn't end with Mark's arrest. The criminals, knowing she was now vulnerable, turned their attention to her. They threatened her, warning that if she didn't comply with their orders, she and her children would face the consequences. Fear consumed her. She had already been dragged into this dark world by Mark's choices, and now she was being forced to play along. The weight of the decisions she had made to protect her children felt unbearable. What was supposed to be a short-term fix for their financial troubles had spiraled into a nightmare that no one could have predicted. Desperate to protect Emma and Ethan, Rebecca tried to keep a brave face for her children, but the strain was too much. The police, who had been investigating Mark and the syndicate, now had a closer watch on Rebecca as well. She found herself trapped, unable to escape the suffocating grip of the criminals or the law. She had gone from a woman hoping for a better future for her family to a desperate mother trying to hold everything together, even as it all unraveled. In the end, Rebecca and Mark's choices had led them down a path from which there was no return. Mark was eventually convicted, sentenced to prison for his involvement in the syndicate's crimes. Rebecca, too, faced legal consequences for her part in the cover-up. Their children, the very reason they had taken such risks, were left to pick up the pieces of a broken life. Emma and Ethan were placed into foster care, as Rebecca was deemed unfit to care for them. The dream of a better life for their children had evaporated, replaced by the harsh reality of the consequences of their actions. The lessons they had learned too late were brutal ones: that crime, no matter the reason, would only lead to more pain, and that the path they had chosen in the name of love had ultimately destroyed everything they held dear. The family that had once been full of hope and promise was now scattered, each left to deal with the aftermath of their decisions in their own way. The future they had fought for was nothing but a distant memory.